So UFC OKC's main event is official. We were hearing rumblings that this was going to be the headliner. But during the UFC Vegas 119 broadcast, they made it official. Dricus Du Plessis is back, and he's taking on Kamaru Usman as Kamaru is moving up to 185 pounds. And this is a fascinating matchup to me. And we're going to break it all down in this video because I feel like a lot of people out there are going to be very quick to say, well, DDP by however he wants, man. That Looney Tune style of striking, man. DDP's going to be stumbling and bumbling all over the place on some roller skates. And then Kamaru's going to slip on a banana peel. The piano's going to fall out of the sky and land on Kamaru in OKC. And that's going to be all she wrote, and Kamaru's just going to ride off into retirement, and then DDP's going to fight for the belt again. And I feel like we're getting a little bit too far ahead of ourselves in terms of assessing the fight in that manner, because I actually believe that these guys could potentially be a disastrous matchup for each other. So we're going to talk a lot about that in this video because I think this is a great fight, right? Dricus Du Plessis, a former champion, right? Having both wins over Sean Strickland, beating Israel Adesanya, and DDP to me is one of the most exciting fighters in the UFC. I always like watching DDP fight, his chaotic style, and we're going to talk a lot about his style in this fight because as I was going back and watching a lot of DDP fights, man, this guy is so much more technical in a way, especially with the kicking game, than what I feel like a lot of people want to give him credit for. And I know DDP said before, like, when people are breaking down my fights and they're talking about this technique, that technique, he's like, what are you talking about? I just throw stuff, right? So I don't want to get too, technical when it comes to Dricus' striking, but his kicks are lightning fast, man. When I was going back watching these Strickland fights, because Strickland's been fighting a lot recently, I have a very, very different appreciation for DDP's striking style, and I think it could potentially be a big problem for Usman in this fight, but we've seen a couple things in Dricus' game, not just the wrestling, that I think Kamaru could possibly give Dricus some problems with in this fight. But before we get into the fight, I just want to show you what the card is looking like because, of course, you can always count on the UFC website to not be fully up to date when they announce a massive fight, but we can always rely on Tapology to have us covered, man. The main event, DDP versus Usman, an absolute banger, right? And I think Kamaru is probably, I'd say, the second greatest welterweight of all time behind the great George St. Pierre. Usman's got an incredible resume, an incredible legacy, and now towards the tail end of his career, imagine if he could go out here and beat a fighter like DDP and somehow get his hands on the 185-pound title. That would be massive in terms of legacy for Kamaru. But Brad Tavares versus Marc-Andre Barrieu, kind of a, battle of two grizzled vets that are a little bit chinny, but that'll be an action-packed fight. That'll be a fun back and forth. Kevin Holland versus Jacoby Smith. It's a banger matchup. Very intriguing, right? Jacoby Smith, he's kind of got the Daniel Cormier blessing, right? He's got that wrestling background at OSU, and his striking is coming a long way, right? Kind of reminds me of DC in a way. Obviously different because he's a welterweight, but he's, ripped, jacked, very, very strong, powerful, very, very athletic, coming off of a very dominant win over Josiah Harrell to where that was a ferocious stoppage, man. That was a nasty, ground and pound finish, and he's getting tested big time against Kevin Holland. In the fight before Jacoby Smith's most recent fight, we saw him struggle a little bit against Nico Price in moments, and not necessarily struggle, but we just kind of expected him to run over Nico, and when it didn't happen, we had to see him dig a little bit deep, and I think that that's something that could potentially be very helpful for Smith moving forward, because Kevin Holland is fighting like every other month, right? He's super active. He's been in there with some of the best guys in the world. So there really isn't anything that Kevin hasn't seen. And we've seen Holland at 170. His grappling tends to hold up quite a bit better than what it normally does at 185. So a very interesting test for Jacoby Smith. Jared Cannonier versus CLD. Very interesting matchup, right? Cannonier, older in his career, maybe slowed down a little bit here. And CLD is just one of the most dynamic and flashy strikers at 185 pounds, coming off of a big win against Roman Dolidze. That's an interesting fight. And then Tommy McMillan versus Alberto Montez. that's one of the best fights on the entire card, right? The teammate of Sean O'Malley, Tommy McMillan. And listen, man, I was telling you about Tommy. As much as I like him, I think he's exciting. And, he's just a dog. He's not going to give up on himself. We saw that on DWCS. We saw that in his debut. Got a great win. He's very, very hittable. And when he's in there against a guy that's game, that's got good technique, like an Alberto Montez, it could potentially be time to fade Tommy McMillan. But I don't know yet. You stay tuned for whenever I make, my official predictions for this card. Tabitha Ricci, Fatima Klein, very good WMMA fight, because Tabitha Ricci we know is very good, and Fatima Klein has been looking like a savage in women's MMA. And then Alvin Hines back in action, right? Had an impressive, start to the UFC against Alan Fry, who didn't look good at all against Guilherme Pat. Barboza versus Hardy, Chase Hooper, Mitch Ramirez, Franco versus Rodriguez, Alden Correa versus Stuart Nichols, solid, right? Alden Correa trading with Josh Van, excellent boxing against Stuart Nichols, who might be fighting to keep his job in the UFC, right? Solid wrestler, but not much else. Delgado versus Bashi, that's a great fight. Delgado's a very, very slick striker, getting maybe tested for, I'd say, the first legit grappling test he's going to be up against in a really good grappling prospect in Austin Bashi. And then Suk-Young Ko versus John Paul Labozniani, two good fighters on the come up at welterweight. So very solid card, looking good in OKC. Just wanted to show you the card if you weren't familiar with it. I think it's going to be a fun night of fights, man. But let's talk about the main event, and a lot about the main event, because I feel like a lot of people are going to be very, very quick to write off Kamaru Usman. And I kind of understand it to a degree because, he's 39. He's been relatively inactive over the past few years. And, he's sitting out wanting a title shot against Islam Makhachev. And that was just kind of rubbing people the wrong way. And it's like, shoot your shot, Kamaru, but he should not have gotten the title shot whatsoever. Right? So, the fact that he's moving up to 185, we heard rumblings of him possibly making this move. And we heard that it could potentially be Dricus Du Plessis. And to me, this is a very interesting fight because both dudes have the ability to cause each other big problems, right? Because what we've seen throughout Dricus's career is he tends to struggle with very good wrestlers against Derek Brunson, against Khamzat Chimaev, and we know that Khamzat's an absolute beast, but you get my point. If there's a hole in DDP's game, it's been the wrestling. Now, he's been away for some time, right? He's kind of been a little bit low-key up until kind of the Khamzat Strickland fight. We were seeing some media with him, but really has DDP been working on some things? I imagine he has with his coach Mornay Visser, right? Because after all the things they were saying after the Khamzat fight, we weren't practicing the crucifix, all these wild things. I would like to think that they have been working a ton on the takedown defense and working on getting up from the bottom and all those kinds of things, because Kamaru Usman, even though he's older in his career, he's got those wobbly knees and, maybe isn't necessarily the same guy he was in his prime. He still has very, very good wrestling, but obviously I don't think that he is nearly the level of grappler at this point in his career compared to a guy like Khamzat Chimaev. And on the feet, DDP, he's big, he's physical, and an absolute handful for anybody at 185, and I think he could be a handful for just about anybody at 205 as well. So here's what makes this very, very interesting to me. Kamaru's 39, right? So to say that Usman is still in the prime of his career, I don't think that would be accurate, right? I know he's still good, and we'll talk about the Buckley performance in a little bit because I think that that's pretty important to bring up considering, the way that Sean Brady just handled Buckley, but we'll get to that. 39 years of age, coming off of a very dominant win in a 25-minute fight over Joaquin Buckley. So it's like a lot of people, including myself in a way, I was kind of, writing off Usman a little bit. I'm like, he's older, the UFC's trying to build him up, and then now we're realizing, well, yeah, Buckley's pretty good, but he's got some major holes in his game. Right, so at 39 years of age, Kamaru was just able to take him down, control him, landed some shots on the feet, right? But his striking to me looked a little bit labored. It looked a little bit off, right? So that's a little bit concerning coming into this fight. But historically, throughout the career of Kamaru Usman, we know that he has an outstanding jab, and he's got a really, really good straight right hand that follows it down the pipe. So Kamaru Usman's jab, his right hand, his 1-2s, that's kind of what he sticks to on the feet, right? When he starts throwing the uppercuts and hooks, it gets a little noodly, it gets a little kind of wild, and he just kind of dips his head and hopes and fires. Can't be doing that against Dricus Du Plessis. And I think that's where experience and the toughness, obviously, that Kamaru brings to the table, because outside of getting knocked out by that head kick from Leon Edwards later on in the fight, a fight that Kamaru was dominating, he's been historically very, very tough, very, very durable, right? Obviously moving up to 185 here, but he's a tough guy. And he's got a ton of championship experience. Kamaru's been in numerous 5-round fights. So moving up to, 185 here, committing to the move, having notice, having time to prepare for it, I think it's going to be different than when he fought Khamzat Chimaev on a shorter notice, right? I think physically he's going to look a little bit different, right? And he has so much experience. He's seen so many different styles of fighters, not like a DDP, but he's been there and done that, right? And I think coaching is potentially going to be a big, big factor in this fight, because even though Mornay Fisser, was saying kind of a bunch of Looney Tunes kind of stuff right after the Khamzat fight, and he kind of came off as some cope, I still think he's a solid coach. I think he's a solid coach, right? Because a lot of the game plans that they've had for DDP in other fights have been really good, right? And I think that Kamaru Usman, we've seen him, he's very well coached, right? Henry Hoof, Trevor Whitman. Trevor Whitman, one of the best coaches of all time. Clearly, right? The way that Gaethje just fought Ilia Topuria, fighting behind the jab, and that's one of the reasons that, in my opinion, Usman's jab has become just a massive weapon for him, from working with Trevor Whitman, getting his boxing together, right? I know he's got some kicks to the body and stuff like that, but really it's the hands of Kamaru Usman. And that, on the feet, we've seen Dricus Du Plessis have some issues with straight shots. We've seen him have issues with guys that have wrestling. Does Kamaru not have both of those things? So even though he's older, Kamaru has a ton of experience and I think does have some skills to give Dricus some problems in this fight. But the thing about this, Dricus is not 39. Dricus is 32 years of age and in the prime of his career, right? Obviously, yeah, he lost the belt, but he's been fighting the best guys in the world at 185 pounds, right? Robert Whittaker, Sean Strickland twice, Adesanya, Khamzat Chimaev. He's been in there with the who's who, man. He's been in there with the who's who, and he is a massive 185er. This is probably going to be the biggest dude that Kamaru's ever fought, right? And DDP's an excellent striker, and I know it's kind of all over the place and kind of darting into range with the blitz, but man, his kicks are fast. Go back and watch those Strickland fights, how fast his kicks are flying up, right? Even the Adesanya fights, right? And DDP can fight very well out of both stances. He darts into range with the blitz. He's got power, right? Rips to the body well, the way he was able to put Robert Whittaker away, right? And his power combined with that kind of wild style where he's just kind of bulldozing forward, backed by that grit and toughness, like DDP's a handful. He's a handful for anybody to deal with. And one of the best things you could do if you have good grappling is find a way to put DDP on his back and neutralize some of that awkward explosiveness that you have to be up against when you fight him. And I think that that's probably what Kamaru Usman is going to look to do. But let's play a little bit of MMA math real quick. Both of these guys have fought Khamzat and Sean Strickland. Now, granted, I don't want to talk maybe too much about Usman versus Strickland because that was so many years ago and it was down at 170 pounds. And I think that, Sean Strickland is a completely different fighter than when he fought Usman back then. But still, right, Kamaru Usman was able to touch him up on the feet, had a little bit of success with the wrestling, but a lot of it was Usman was landing some good shots on the feet, was able to hurt Sean Strickland. But like I said, Strickland at 85, I feel like he's been much better, but still something to bring up, right? Because we've seen DDP in there with Strickland twice. Right, the first fight, very, very close. I kind of thought Strickland won it. Right, the jab was busting DDP up. Right, again, the jab. And then in the second fight, and with DDP, it was a gritty fight, right? Landed a couple takedowns, was able to land some really good shots on Strickland as well. And in the second fight, he just dominated Strickland, right? I know Strickland said something about maybe a shoulder injury or an arm injury or whatever, but either way, DDP just sweeped him across the cards, man. It was a dominant performance. Had a lot more of an answer for the jab, was countering very well. Those kicks were flying up out of nowhere, right? So they have both fought Sean Strickland, so we want to play the MMA math game. They've both beaten Strickland, right? And then you look at the Khamzat fights, two very, 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 very different fights. And again, styles make fights. We all understand that, right? DDP got taken down, basically dominated and controlled by Khamzat for almost 25 minutes, like for basically all 5 rounds, right? DDP was able to get up from time to time and make something happen, especially late, but it was predominantly Khamzat controlling him on the deck. And then Kamaru got almost submitted and dominated in the first round, right? But then in rounds 2 and 3, he was able to keep it on the feet for the most part and was able to land some really good straight shots and put Khamzat in not necessarily a ton of trouble, but was able to start making some Khamzat fans worried out there as Usman really started to push the pace and figure some things out. So they have some common opponents, and I think that the Khamzat fight, given that it's more recent for both, it was the last time we saw Dricus, and it was the last time that we saw Kamaru at 185 pounds. So something that could potentially give us some things to take a look at, because the last time we saw DDP, almost a year ago, against an absolute wrecking ball that is Khamzat. And I understand that Chimaev just lost a close one to Sean Strickland, but let's not forget how dominant of a grappler overall that Khamzat is. And this is one of the reasons that I couldn't pick DDP to beat Khamzat, was because of the fact that we've seen, especially in the Derek Brunson fight, a guy that is a wrestler, right, has good ground and pound, not much of a submission threat. He was able to take DDP down and control him for a lot of their fight. Right, and I know that, of course, DDP battled back into the fight, was able to put him away. We understand all that. But we saw Brunson controlling him. Right, we saw Khamzat Chimaev, and I know Khamzat's a beast, easily take him down, right? Chain things together. Even when DDP would initially defend well, like, he was not sprawling well at all. And even if he kind of did because of his physicality, Khamzat would just reshoot, get underneath, would be relentless with it, and find a way to get him down. And the difference with Khamzat compared to a guy like Kamaru, a guy like Derek Brunson, Khamzat has a dangerous submission threat. He's got solid jiu-jitsu skills as well, backed with the wrestling. So you can't just recklessly explode up, right? And obviously we know that Khamzat has world-class control. So we saw some moments on the feet. You know, there wasn't a ton of moments on the feet, but when they were, Dricus was letting some decent shots, right? He stung Khamzat with a good shot down the middle. But outside of that, it was just one of those performances where a guy in DDP who was having answers for everybody ran into someone that felt almost like his kryptonite-like matchup. And you know that Kamaru was looking at that saying, yeah, you know, maybe I'm not Khamzat. I'm sure he thinks he's Khamzat, but he's not Khamzat, right? But he still has a high-level wrestling game. And if he can keep DDP down, that could definitely give Dricus some issues. And the last time, you know, we saw Kamaru at 185, it was in 2023 on short notice at 185. And it was competitive. It was a very, very competitive fight. Outside the first round where Kamaru almost got submitted and finished by Khamzat. And then it was a good back and forth, right? I still thought Khamzat was able to get it done, but very close. Very, very close either way, right? But let's talk about this performance against Buckley, because this was the last time we saw Usman, 5-rounder. And at the time, we're going, well, man, Kamaru Usman, like, it felt like he lost a step, had been away for a while, had been really, really inactive, and had been out for a couple years. And it's like, man, Buckley's surging. He's on a hot streak. He had just beat the brakes off of Colby Covington. And it's like, man, is Buckley about to go out here and make a name off Kamaru Usman? And Kamaru said, not so fast. Watch this. I'm going to take things back in time and break out my wrestling, because a lot of what we saw throughout Kamaru's career, you know, towards the later part of it, we didn't see a ton of offensive wrestling from him, right? A lot of it was just him turning into a striker for the most part. I know he looked to grapple against Leon Edwards, and I know he's got the wobbly knees, and that's definitely, you know, a factor for sure. You know, so we saw Usman kind of get away from the wrestling to where he basically was more of a striker, especially towards the later part of his career, right? When you knock out Masvidal, you stop Gilbert Burns on the feet, you know, by landing a good jab on him. It's going to make you feel a lot more confident in your striking, especially, you know, when you're working with Henry Hooft, who's a mastermind on the feet, and Trevor Whitman as well. Remember, we got to see Usman kind of turn back the hands of time. Vintage Usman, mixing in the takedowns, putting Buckley on his back, beating him up with ground and pound, running him into the jab on the feet and the right hand behind it. But to me in this fight, Usman striking looked a little odd. He looked a little odd. He was kind of ducking his head, dipping it down, winging some punches, to where if he does that in a DDP fight, I could see that being a massive problem for him, right? But this was a performance that after this happened, we were like, wow, Usman's back. And then we see Sean Brady go out there and dominate Buckley even more impressively than Usman did. Took him down at will in every single round, kept him down, bullied him on the ground. Don't let him bully your son, right? Bullied him on the ground, beating him up with ground and pound, peppering him. And obviously there's a different threat because Brady has the submission skills, but I know Buckley was kind of working with Usman coming into the fight, but Buckley shucked off a couple takedowns early, and then it was all Sean Brady. Took him down and dominated him. Now, to be fair, Sean Brady's an elite grappler. So to say that, well, it just completely doesn't mean anything anymore because of the fact that, well, look what Brady did, not necessarily fair, because Brady's a different overall grappling threat and a guy that's in the prime of his career. Right, but I will say this, while it was a dominant win, I think it lost a little bit of the wow factor to it, because whatever you see when Usman's saying, I want a title shot, look what I did to Buckley, and then Brady goes out there and does that, we're like, oh, you know, it's not as special as what maybe it felt at once. But it was still impressive for Usman to go out there and do that against a guy in the prime of his career as explosive like Buckley. But here's the things that I think could potentially give DDP some problems in this fight. When I watch DDP's game, the biggest issues I see are him dealing with the wrestling and the jab. right? Because I think on the feet, Dricus can strike with just about anybody, right? And I understand that Sean Strickland, I've been saying before, I think he has the best jab in the sport. So just because you're getting jabbed up by Sean Strickland, like, it is what it is. Like, Sean Strickland, he jabs everybody up. But the reality is Kamaru Usman's got a really good jab as well. That's like Kamaru's best shot on the feet, is sticking and moving with the jab, throwing it to the body, bringing it upstairs. And I would imagine that Kamaru moving up to 185, he's going to probably be even more, strong than he was at 170. And I would like to think that if he's keeping that welterweight lighter man skill per se, moving up to 185, that jab will still be snapping. Right, and I'm sure Kamaru's looking at the tape, Trevor Whitman, Henry Hooft, and they're saying, well, yeah, maybe they're going to have confidence in Usman's jab, but I don't think Usman's jab is as good as Strickland, but it's still good. And if I'm watching DDP, no matter what stance DDP's in, when he does that charging into range type of deal, boom, that's where you can sting him with the jab. And I think that that's what Kamaru is going to look to do. And we know Kamaru can fight very well out of both stances as well as DDP, right? So they're going to be kind of playing the back and forth. Which stance are we in battle? And Usman can throw the jab from either side. Very, very good with the jab. And we've seen that DDP had a very, very difficult time dealing with the jab of Strickland in the first fight. Did a much better job in the rematch, right? So maybe that is something that he's fixed. And having been in there with Strickland twice, preparing for a guy that's just going to walk forward and look to jab you up for 25 minutes, to set up his offense, maybe that was good practice for DDP coming into this fight. But the biggest thing for me has got to be the wrestling, because I know that Kamaru is not Khamzat Chimaev, right? But if you want to draw some comparisons to like a Derek Brunson, and I know that Brunson, like especially in his prime, was a really good wrestler, but Kamaru Usman's got good technique. Now, the problem with Usman is he's not a super explosive into the takedown kind of guy. He kind of moseys on forward, eventually kind of feints the level changes, can grab that single, get a hold of you and take you down, push you up against the fence, trip you, right? Kamaru's a crafty grappler. But what could potentially be a problem for Dricus is when he darts into range, throwing these blitzing combinations, right? He kind of charges in with his chin down, right? The Superman style blitzing in. That gives your hips and allows Kamaru to duck underneath and take you down. So I think that we're going to see Dricus, still patiently use some of those blitzes, but I think he's going to have to be a little bit more careful in how he does that in a fight against a guy like Kamaru Usman, who's not nearly as explosive on his shots as a guy like Khamzat, right? Khamzat can just dive at a takedown, to where Usman, I don't think that he's going to be able to do the same things as Khamzat in that realm. So I do think that that's something that can play to the advantage of DDP. But to me, the things that would be the most troubling for Dricus in this fight are Kamaru's straight shots down the middle, because as good as DDP does at parrying and countering, he leaves his head a little bit on the center line at times, to where we've seen him get tagged by straight shots like Adesanya getting the jab popping, to where I think that that's something Usman is going to look to really do in this fight, is try to tear DDP up with the jab, get him to kind of rush in. That's going to be those times to where Usman can duck underneath and get to his takedowns. But I think if DDP has been, working on the takedown defense, which I imagine he has, that anti-grappling style to, grab the wizard, get back to the feet, not get himself in these bad positions, man, I think on the feet, DDP is going to be a handful for Kamaru to deal with. So if he could solve the jab of Usman and keep this fight on the feet, and again, if you get taken down by Usman, like, what's really the concern? I know that Usman has solid ground and pound, but it's not like his jiu-jitsu threat is world-class, at least that we've seen throughout his career thus far. So I think that that's going to allow DDP to explode and take more chances, because against Khamzat, you have to be worried about being submitted, to where, against Brunson or Usman, you don't really have to do that. And that's why we saw him kind of bench pressing Brunson off of him. Right, and I feel like Dricus is one of these guys who's been so physically strong that, his jiu-jitsu is very good, but in terms of the wrestling, maybe some of the fundamentals weren't there, because he was getting away with it because he's just a very strong guy. Right, and we see that at times, right? Especially in the gym. You see a guy that's he's a very strong dude. He can kind of just bench press people off, not necessarily use the best of technique, but when you're in there against guys that have good fundamentals, they're strong, and they have good technique, you might not always just be able to use that explosive strength to get out of certain areas. And I think that that's where DDP, taking some time away to work on some things, I think he's going to come in and have the answers for these things that Kamaru is going to look to bring to the table. And listen, when you look at Kamaru's biggest issues, I think they're on the feet against guys with footwork and good striking, right? Obviously, when it comes to the grappling, the only grappler that we've really seen put Kamaru in any danger was against Khamzat. Right? Khamzat was the only one that put him really in any danger. Outside of that, it's really been Kamaru having the grappling edge. And then on the feet, guys like Leon Edwards, right? Masvidal, I know, Kamaru was able to land some good shots on him and eventually knock him out, but we saw, right, he had to kind of push Masvidal into a dirty fight up against the fence, foot stomping him, right? Little shoulder strikes, kind of play that game, take him down, put him on his back. Against Leon Edwards, didn't have a lot of success taking him down, especially in the trilogy. Right, Leon Edwards was doing a great job sticking and moving, fighting the hands, right? And that's the other thing about Kamaru's game is if you can fight the hands like what Leon was doing, I'm sure that these are all things that DDP is going to be watching, right? Because what we've seen is a guy like Colby Covington landing good shots on Usman. And I know that that's a stylistic thing, right? Colby kind of, the cardio and punches and bunches, but still, he was landing a lot of shots on Usman, right? In a southpaw. Leon Edwards, a southpaw. I know he switches, but look at the shots he was landing against Usman, right? Ripping the kicks to the inside leg, then to the body, and then eventually setting up that beautiful high kick that KO'd Usman in the second fight, right? And then in the third fight, it was even more, the second fight, Usman was clearly winning, right, until he got KO'd. And then in the third fight, it was all Leon Edwards pretty much. So I think if you're DDP, you're looking at that southpaw stance saying, yeah, my lead leg is going to be closer to where Usman can kind of snatch that single, but I have a fast kicking game. If I'm DDP, I'm looking at it going, man, I got a fast kicking game. I can rip to the lead leg. I can throw kicks to the body, and I can throw kicks upstairs. And I think DDP's got faster, whippier kicks than a guy like Leon. It was the way that Leon set it up that was able to land on Kamaru Usman. So I'm sure that these are all things that DDP is going to be taking note of, man. And in these fights, Kamaru, especially in the trilogy, not a whole lot of grappling success against Leon Edwards. So if DDP has fixed the takedown defense and has a better way to get back to the feet, and I kind of have my reservations on the Khamzat fight saying, well, I feel like a lot of that was he was worried about being submitted. To where in this fight, you don't necessarily have to be worried about being submitted by Kamaru unless he throws a new wrinkle into his game and submits DDP, and it's something that we really haven't seen from Kamaru per se. So from what we've seen, it's basically the ground and pound of Usman, which then gives opportunities for DDP to look to scramble. But I think carefully blitzing into range, not just kind of leaving your hips out there on a platter for Usman to be able to take you down. We've seen that especially later in his career, Usman tends to have a very difficult time being able to get a hold of guys that are doing a lot of moving around. And I know that DDP's footwork is a lot more kind of exploding in and out, right? He doesn't have, I would say, the best lateral movement, but he's still solid in terms of moving laterally, kind of not being a sitting target. And I think, man, DDP out of that southpaw stance, I think he's going to be attacking the heck out of Usman's body trying to set up a high kick. I really do, man, because we've seen that you could get Usman reaching, you could get him reaching, and you kind of saw him basically almost having flashbacks against Leon Edwards when a head kick would go whistling by and Usman would just barely block it. So I definitely think that that's a vulnerability in Kamaru's game. And I think DDP on the feet is a handful for anybody to deal with, man. And I feel like Usman, a guy that we've seen not lose a ton of fights, right? 2 of them are to Leon Edwards. 1 of them to Khamzat on short notice, which was very, very competitive, right? Basically, those have been the recent losses per se of Kamaru Usman. And then outside of that, I mean, he's world-class, man. One of the best fighters of all time. I think he's the second best welterweight probably of all time behind GSP. I mean, he's up there, man. And Usman is also a very, very high IQ fighter. He's going to come in with a good game plan. He's not just going to, oh, yeah, I'll move up to 185. I'm later in my career. Like, Usman's going to do everything he can to make this count. And I feel like the jab and the wrestling, and Usman's got good kicks to the body, right? I'll throw kicks to the legs as well, mix things up. But I think those straight shots down the middle that Kamaru likes to throw are going to be something that can be a big weapon for him against DDP because Dricus is very durable. He's a very, very hard guy to hurt. So I don't know that Usman's able to hurt him on the feet, right? And I feel like it's going to be one of those game plans where Usman's going to fight behind the jab, slip in the right hand behind it. And if DDP gets overzealous and over swings and gets too chaotic, that's where Usman can duck underneath, take him down, put him on his back, and take away some of that wildness that DDP brings to the table. But if I had to kind of, say where my head is at right now, I'm really thinking that Dricus Du Plessis wins this fight, man. And I think that as long as he has the answers for Kamaru's wrestling and he's able to just kind of deal with the jab on the feet and have the answer for that, and I imagine he will, having, been in there with Sean Strickland twice, I think DDP is going to be, a handful for Usman on the feet. He's explosive, he's fast, he's awkward, he's unpredictable. And I feel like, preparing for Usman is a lot easier than preparing for a guy like DDP who's big, strong, well-rounded. And Dricus is a good submission game. So it's not to say that if Usman takes a bad shot and leaves his head on the hip and, DDP could get his legs, bring Usman into his guard, he could lock up a guillotine or something. So DDP hits hard. He works to the body well. He has very good shot selection. And I think the time away, because DDP was very active. He was fighting a lot, right? Was on that quest to get the belt, defended it a couple times. I think the time away will benefit him very, very well to work on some things, add some new wrinkles to his game, and patch up some of the holes when it comes to the wrestling. And listen, I know he got dominated by Khamzat, and as good of a wrestler as Kamaru is, he's later in his career. Just because you dominate Joaquin Buckley on the ground, I don't think means that you're going to come out here and take down DDP at will and be able to keep him on his back to get it done in a 25-minute fight. So if Usman were to win, I think it's by decision. I think it's by him, exposing that DDP, well, not exposing, but just showing that DDP's made no improvements with the takedown defense, which I would find that very surprising. And then I think, that's his path to victory. Jab, take Dricus down, neutralize him, keep him on the deck, win on the scorecards, or it would be Dricus Du Plessis beating up Kamaru on the feet. Like, I think if they're stuck on the feet for long periods of time, like we're seeing Colby, we're seeing Masvidal, we're seeing these guys, put the heat on Usman on the feet. I know Usman's a solid striker, and he's gotten a lot better, man, throughout his career, but DDP is much better on the feet, much more dynamic, very, very explosive. He's got power in his hands, power in his kicks. But I'm curious to see what the power of Usman looks like now that I would imagine he's been preparing for a move to 185 for a while now. And already a guy that was big at 170, I think Usman will probably be very physically imposing at 185. Maybe have some more beef behind his shots, going up 15 pounds here. But we know DDP, he's a big 185er. He's got power. He's hard to put away. This is a banger matchup, man. So if DDP has made the correct improvements, I think he wins this fight. That's the summary overall. If he could stop the takedowns, he's fixed that hole in his game, I think he bangs up Kamaru Usman and beats him up on the feet to where it would be a massive problem for Usman. But if he hasn't fixed that, that's why I think Kamaru could be a big issue for him, because we know that Usman has the wrestling abilities and good straight shots down the middle that we see land pretty frequently on the dome of Dricus Du Plessis. This is a great fight, man. I'm excited for it. Early lean. I think we get a mid to late round TKO stoppage from Dricus Du Plessis. But if you guys enjoyed this video, do me a favor. Please give it a like. Let me know what you think down in the comments about this fight. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you do not miss an upload. I would appreciate it. I will see you next time.